It was a quiet morning in early June 2001, when the small town of Brookings, South Dakota, awoke to the sound of church bells and the rustle of the prairie wind. On most days, people here moved at their own unhurried rhythm, farmers tending to fields, students biking down Main Street, and shopkeepers greeting one another with easy smiles. But on that morning, something felt different. Her calmness that had long defined the town gave way to unease when word spread that a young woman hadn't made it home from her evening shift the night before. Her name was Angie Warren, a 27-year-old librarian at the local public library. She was known for her kindness, her quiet humor, and her love for books about history and travel. Angela lived with her older sister, Denise, in a modest blue house just off 4th Street. She was the type of person everyone in Brookings seemed to know, friendly, dependable, and warm-hearted. On the night of June 5, 2001, she finished her shift at 9:00 p.m., waved goodbye to a co-worker, and set off toward home. It was only a short walk of about 10 minutes, but she never arrived. By morning, Denise realized something was wrong. Angela was never late, never careless, and never unreachable. Her car was still parked behind the library, her bag still inside the passenger seat. She hadn't taken her wallet or house keys. Denise called the police shortly after 7:30 a.m., and within hours, the Brookings Police Department launched a search that would grip the town for decades. At first, the search felt like something temporary, an unfortunate misunderstanding that would soon be resolved. Police combed through the library parking lot, nearby streets, and a small wooded area behind a hardware store. Volunteers from the community joined, calling Angela's name and carrying flashlights even in daylight. Flyers were posted on every lamppost, coffee shop window, and church bulletin board. For a place like Brookings, the idea that someone could simply vanish between one street and the next was unimaginable. Detective Howard Grayson, a veteran officer with 30 years of experience, led the search. He was known for his calm temperament and old-fashioned approach to investigation. He personally interviewed everyone who had seen Angela the previous night, her co-workers, the last patrons at the library, and people who had passed through the neighborhood. Several witnesses recalled seeing her leave the library at closing time, wearing a light blue cardigan and carrying a canvas tote bag. One woman, who lived on 6th Avenue, claimed to have seen Angela crossing the street near a parked, dark-colored pickup truck. But she couldn't recall if anyone was inside. Days turned into weeks. Police dogs followed trails that led nowhere. The community organized candlelight vigils, each one quieter and heavier than the last. News outlets from Sioux Falls and Rapid City picked up the story, turning Angela's photo, bright smile, auburn hair, green eyes, into a statewide symbol of heartbreak. Her family appeared on local television, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Despite the extensive search, no major breakthroughs came. There were no signs of struggle, no physical evidence, and no witnesses beyond those who'd seen her leave work. Detectives began to fear what they didn't want to say out loud, that Angela's case might grow cold. By late July 2001, the investigation had reached a painful standstill. Grayson and his team revisited every possible lead. They interviewed co-workers again, investigated library patrons, and checked nearby rest stops. But nothing concrete surfaced. Angela had simply vanished, and the lack of clues baffled even the most seasoned officers. Denise Warren, Angela's sister, refused to give up hope. Every morning she left a porch light burning, saying it was for Angela to find her way home. Local churches joined in solidarity, lighting candles every Sunday. The whole town began to measure time not by seasons, but by how long Angela had been gone. The first year passed in a haze of unanswered questions. When the snow melted and spring returned, volunteers organized another search near the riverbank outside town. It was then, nearly 11 months after Angela disappeared, that 2 hikers discovered something partially buried near the edge of a wooded trail, a piece of fabric and what appeared to be a necklace. Police arrived swiftly and cordoned off the area. The necklace was later identified by Denise as Angela's, a silver locket engraved with her initials. Nearby authorities recovered skeletal remains, later confirmed to be Angela Warren's through dental records. The discovery shook Brookings to its core. After nearly a year of uncertainty, the reality settled like a heavy fog. The case shifted from a missing person investigation to a homicide inquiry. But even with the discovery, detectives found no obvious cause of death, and no direct evidence linking anyone to the crime. Forensic teams scoured the area. They found traces of disturbed soil and tire marks, but the leads proved thin. An analysis of nearby security cameras showed a dark pickup truck passing through the area on the night Angela disappeared, but the footage was grainy and the plate unreadable. It was enough to suggest a direction, but not enough to close the case. Detective Grayson believed the answer was close, perhaps even within Brookings itself. He started looking at familiar faces, frequent library visitors, people who had seen Angela regularly. Among them was Mark Hanley, a maintenance worker who occasionally repaired fixtures at the library. He was friendly but private and often worked late. Police interviewed him twice. His alibi checked out, and there was nothing to hold him on. Grayson, however, couldn't shake a feeling that something about Hanley's demeanor didn't sit right. Months turned into years. The case faded from headlines, but never from memory. Denise moved out of their childhood home, but stayed in town, determined to keep Angela's story alive. Each year on the anniversary of her disappearance, residents gathered at the library for a small ceremony, a tribute to a woman whose kindness had touched everyone. By 2005, new forensic technology began changing how police approached old cases. DNA analysis, once limited and expensive, became more accessible. State labs began re-examining old evidence, and Brookings police submitted samples from Angela's case for renewed testing. But it wasn't until 2020, nearly 2 decades later, that a crucial discovery would emerge. In early 2020, forensic specialists in Pierre, South Dakota, reanalyzed trace evidence from the fabric found near Angela's remains. This time they detected a partial DNA profile. It was incomplete, but distinctive enough to warrant further testing. Investigators cross-checked the sample against state and national databases, but found no match. Still, they preserved it, hoping technology would soon catch up. In 2023, South Dakota law enforcement launched a new initiative integrating genealogical DNA databases into cold case investigations. This allowed comparisons not just to criminal offenders, but to relatives who had submitted DNA for ancestry tracing. Angela's sample was among the first selected for analysis. Within months, genealogists narrowed the possible familial matches to a handful of surnames, and one of them was Hanley. When Detective Rhodes from the state's cold case unit reopened the file in 2024, she revisited every document, photo, and note. She read Grayson's observations, especially the line that mentioned his unease about Mark Hanley. The suspicion that had lain dormant for years suddenly had new weight. Investigators obtained a warrant to collect Hanley's DNA from a discarded coffee cup outside his workplace. The results, processed in a state-of-the-art lab, were decisive. The genetic material matched the partial profile found on Angela's clothing. After 23 years, the mystery that had haunted Brookings was about to be solved. The morning the DNA confirmation came in, Detective Rachel Rhodes sat in her office, staring at the report for several minutes before she moved. Outside, the South Dakota sky was pale and heavy with clouds, the kind of stillness that seemed to press against the glass. She picked up her phone and dialed the Brookings Police Department, asking to speak to Chief Morrison. When he answered, she said only 5 words, "We have a match, sir." The news spread through the small department like electricity. For younger officers who had grown up hearing about Angela Warren's case, this was more than an investigation. It was part of local history. For Denise Warren, who received the call at her job in Sioux Falls, it felt like the breath she had been holding for 23 years finally left her body. She sat at her desk, hands trembling, trying to take in the words that had haunted her for so long. Mark Hanley, the quiet maintenance worker once questioned in 2001, was now the primary suspect. Investigators began reconstructing his life since that time. They learned he had moved to another town, married briefly, then divorced. He had never left South Dakota. He worked sporadically in construction, often taking jobs that allowed him to travel but never too far. His name had never appeared in any major criminal database, and his record was clean. But when detectives began to map his movements in 2001, a troubling pattern formed, one that placed him near Angela Warren the night she disappeared. Detective Rhodes and her partner, Jason Klein, spent weeks preparing before they approached Hanley. They wanted no missteps, no holes the defense could exploit. When they finally moved forward, it was a crisp October morning in 2024. Hanley was working maintenance. Surveillance teams waited quietly, and when Rhodes gave the signal, they approached him in the parking lot. "Mark Hanley?" Rhodes asked as she stepped out of her vehicle. He turned, squinting at her badge. "Yeah, that's me. I'm Detective Rhodes with the South Dakota Division of Criminal Investigation. We need to talk." He didn't resist. He looked calm, even mildly curious, as they brought him in for questioning. Inside the interview room, the air felt thick. Hanley leaned back, arms folded, his eyes shifting between the detectives. Rhodes started with simple questions: where he'd worked in 2001, whether he remembered the library or Angela Warren. He claimed he barely did, but when Rhodes placed a photograph of Angela on the table, something in his face changed, not fear but recognition. He looked down quickly, then away. "We have some new evidence," she said quietly. "DNA testing wasn't what it is now, but we were able to re-examine items found with Angela. Your genetic profile matches what was recovered." Hanley said nothing at first. The silence stretched long enough that Rhodes could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Finally he leaned forward, his voice low. "You really think I did this?" Klein responded evenly, "We don't think, Mark, the evidence does." For hours they talked. Hanley shifted from denial to confusion to quiet frustration. He claimed he might have accidentally touched something while doing repairs at the library. But when Rhodes presented the full chain of DNA evidence, the locket, the fabric, and the recorded location, his demeanor changed again. His shoulders slumped, his jaw tightened, and the defiance faded from his eyes. He asked for a break. When Rhodes returned, Hanley's tone was softer. "You don't know what it was like back then," he said quietly. "I didn't mean for things to go that far. It was the first crack in his story." The confession that followed came in fragments, pieces of memory and regret. Hanley told them he had seen Angela leave the library that night and offered her a ride because of the rain. She'd refused politely, saying she lived nearby. He followed her anyway, parked near the wooded trail, and when she noticed him, she confronted him. "She was angry," he said. "Told me to leave her alone." He said he panicked, grabbed her arm, and everything after that went wrong. He described trying to hide her body near the trail and returning days later to bury what he could. He'd lived with the secret for years, convincing himself that because no one found out, maybe it would fade away. But he said every time he saw her picture on the anniversary posters, he knew it never really would. When the confession ended, Rhodes simply nodded. She stood up, looked at Hanley, and said, "You've carried this for 23 years. It ends now." The following morning, local media broke the story. "Cold case solved, Brookings woman's 2001 disappearance linked to former resident." The headline was everywhere: newspapers, radio, television, and social media. For the people of Brookings, it was like history coming alive again, this time with an ending no one had expected. Denise Warren watched the news from her living room. The reporter's voice was calm, factual, but she could feel every word. For 2 decades she had wondered who could have done it. A stranger, a drifter, someone passing through town. The idea that it was a man her sister had probably smiled at, someone she might have helped at the library, was unbearable. In the following weeks, the case became a point of renewed attention for cold case investigators statewide. Journalists revisited the original search, the vigils and the volunteers who had never forgotten Angela. Detective Rhodes was interviewed by multiple outlets. When asked how it felt to close such an old case, she said, "Justice delayed isn't justice denied. Sometimes it just takes time for truth to catch up." As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors built their argument meticulously. They had the DNA match, the confession, and years of documented suspicion that all pointed to Hanley. But defense attorneys claimed the confession was coerced, and that the DNA could have been the result of cross-contamination from his time at the library. The courtroom was packed on the first day of proceedings in early 2025. Reporters filled every bench, and townspeople who had once searched the woods for Angela now sat silently, waiting to hear the truth unfold in legal form. Denise was there too, clutching the same silver locket that had been returned to her after forensic testing. During testimony, prosecutors recounted the timeline, Angela's last steps, the discovery of her remains, and the decades of unanswered questions. They presented the lab results and played excerpts from Hanley's recorded confession. When his voice echoed through the courtroom, calm, detached, and remorseful, there wasn't a sound in the room. Hanley's defense tried to cast doubt, focusing on the lack of direct physical evidence beyond the DNA trace. But the confession, coupled with the corroborated movements of his vehicle and the recovered items, was enough to close the gaps. In the final week of the trial, prosecutors called Detective Rhodes to the stand. She spoke clearly, never dramatizing, never embellishing. She told the jury how technology had given Angela a voice after all these years. "When we started this," she said, "we weren't just solving a case. We were finishing a promise. To a sister, to a family, to a town that refused to forget." The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the afternoon of the 2nd, the courtroom fell silent as the four-persons stood. "We find the defendant, Mark Hanley, guilty on all counts." Denise closed her eyes. Tears rolled down her face, but her expression was one of peace more than pain. It had taken nearly half her life, but she had the answer now. Outside the courthouse, the crowd applauded quietly, not in celebration but in respect. Reporters captured images of Denise walking down the courthouse steps, sunlight breaking through clouds above her. She said softly, "Angela finally got her day." The months that followed the verdict brought a strange kind of quiet to Brookings. After years of living under a shadow of uncertainty, people began to breathe differently. The story that had defined their town for more than 2 decades was finally at peace. Yet even with the conviction, there were no real winners, only relief tempered with the weight of time. Mark Hanley was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the judge read the sentence, Hanley nodded faintly as if he'd already expected it. There were no outbursts, no appeals for sympathy. He simply turned and allowed the deputies to lead him away. His final statement was barely audible. "I hope she can forgive me." But in that courtroom, forgiveness wasn't his to ask for anymore. For Denise Warren, the end of the trial didn't mean the end of her sister's story. A week later, she returned to the small blue house they had once shared. Most of the furniture was different now, and the walls had been painted, but the memories hadn't faded. She sat in Angela's old reading chair, a soft patch of sunlight on the floor beside her, and opened a scrapbook filled with photographs, Angela smiling at a picnic, Angela holding their family cat, Angela standing in front of the library steps. That evening, she placed the silver locket on the bookshelf next to a framed picture of Angela. "You're home now," she whispered. In the months that followed, the library staff organized a memorial reading room in Angela's honor. It was filled with the kinds of books she loved, travel journals, poetry, and novels about discovery and hope. Above the entrance hung a small plaque that read, "For Angela Warren, whose story reminds us never to stop searching for truth." Detective Rachel Rhodes attended the dedication ceremony quietly, standing toward the back. She didn't make a speech or draw attention. She simply watched as townspeople filled the room, each person touching the plaque as they walked in. Later that evening, she met Denise outside. They talked for a while about Angela, about how one case could change the rhythm of a whole community. Before they parted, Denise said, "You didn't just solve this, you gave her back to us." Rhodes smiled softly. "Your town did that," she replied. "We just helped it see what it already knew." News of the solved case reached beyond South Dakota. National outlets picked up the story as an example of how persistence and evolving forensic science could breathe new life into forgotten cases. Other departments began reviewing their old files, inspired by what genealogical testing and new DNA tracing could achieve. In many ways, Angela's case became a turning point, a reminder that even the smallest pieces of evidence could still speak after years of silence. As winter settled over Brookings that year, snow blanketed the town in stillness. The library lights glowed softly against the white drifts, and through the windows one could see people reading quietly in the memorial room. Denise visited often, sometimes bringing flowers or sitting near the window just to think. She said she felt closer to Angela there than anywhere else. Meanwhile, Detective Rhodes moved on to other investigations, but she kept Angela's file in her office, framed and sealed. To her, it was a symbol of why she'd chosen the job in the first place, not for recognition, but for closure. In interviews, she would often say, "Truth doesn't get old. It just waits." Years later, when people in Brookings talked about Angela Warren, they no longer spoke in whispers. They spoke with warmth, remembering her laughter, her quiet way of listening, and her kindness that had touched so many. The town didn't forget that. Every June, on the anniversary of Angela's disappearance, the town still gathered at the library steps. Candles lined the path, just as they had during the first vigil all those years ago. But this time the air was filled not with grief, but with gratitude. Denise always stood in front holding a single candle. When the crowd fell silent, she'd raise it high and say, "We remember her, and we remember that truth always finds a way." The last time Rhodes visited Brookings, she stopped by the library late in the evening. The lights were off except for one lamp in the memorial room. A soft glow spilled onto the floor, catching the edges of the plaque with Angela's name. For a long time, Rhodes stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the building. The same library where everything had started. She took a deep breath, then whispered under her breath, "You can rest now." As she walked away, snow began to fall again, the flakes catching the lamplight like tiny sparks. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that only comes when something long buried finally finds its truth. The story of Angela Warren became part of South Dakota's legacy, a tale of endurance, love, and the power of science, meeting the determination of memory. For those who had searched, prayed, and waited, justice had not come quickly, but it had come completely. And as the years passed, that truth stayed written in the hearts of the people of Brookings, that even the coldest cases can still find warmth again, if someone keeps the light burning. If you followed this journey to the end, if you felt the weight of this story and the quiet hope that comes with resolution, remember that there are still families out there waiting for answers. Every view, every share, every voice helps bring those names back to light. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us as we bring you more stories where justice finally finds its way home.